I'd like to open out this discussion a little further, taking it away from a single example, such as Seven Eves, to look more broadly at how we might use extreme fiction as empirical evidence in our research. And I've changed the title, Marcus, to Research in an Age of Normalized Unprecedentedness, based on the observation, if you look at what's happened around the world just over the past 2 or 3 years, what we appear to be seeing is a range of unpredictable extreme events that nobody anticipated. In other words, the unanticipated, the extreme, is in danger of becoming routine, normalized unprecedentedness. And some of you have probably already seen this sign, this joke in a bookshop window, which says that the post-apocalypse fiction section has now been moved to current affairs to reflect that situation of normalized unprecedentedness. Marcus and I did an EGOS presentation, was it 3 or 4 years ago, Marcus? And it was based on a zombie movie at the time. And we did the presentation, and somebody came up to us, somebody from the audience came up to us afterwards and complained about our use of a zombie movie. And that's what he said. That wasn't research evidence. Somebody just made that up. It's just a writer's imagination. How can you possibly use or hope to use that kind of material as empirical evidence for any kind of theoretical understanding or theory building? But that's the point. The point is that it was imaginative. And to just offer 2 quick examples to support that view, 9/11, the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, was subsequently described as a failure of imagination. But a paper by Carl Weick points out that Richard Clarke, who was a US security advisor, had imagined that the terrorist use of planes could be possible. But his inspiration for that foresight was not conventional security intelligence sources, but Tom Clancy's novels. And similarly, there's another US security analyst called Anthony Cordesman, who started to look at possible future biological weapons threats. And he argues that those kinds of threats are going to be random, unpredictable, come from various sources, from actors with quite different motives, and that our future security environment is going to be more closely aligned with what he calls the Buffy paradigm, based on the kind of situations that Buffy the Vampire Slayer has to face in the cult TV program. Apologies for those of you who haven't seen it. I'm sad to say I have, and I've watched every episode across every season. Some of it's better than others, but they play it for laughs. It's fun. Anyway, the Buffy paradigm. These are just 2 examples of the way in which the security community has started to turn to fiction as a way of imagining what might happen in future, what kind of threats we might face. Just to turn to another fairly well-known author, Margaret Atwood, and thanks to one of Marcus's friends, Mark Durand, I discovered this quote from her in a radio interview that she did 2 or 3 years ago. And Margaret Atwood says, "Why does fiction matter? Storytelling is one of the oldest human technologies we have. And what does fiction allow you to do? It allows you to try out without actually having to do it. Utopias and dystopias are ways of testing out possible arrangements in society without actually having to do them." In other words, we can road test ideas. Fiction is a flight simulator. We can road test ideas in fiction without actually having to apply them in practice. And Marcus and I got some feedback recently on an article that we submitted, which of course has come back for revise and resubmit. And one of the reviewers said, "Well, why are you using fiction? Why don't you talk to scenario planners, to futurists, speak to conspiracy theorists, strategic planners?" The simple answer to that question is they don't write stories. They don't capture the human drama. They don't capture the organizational drama in which we would be interested. So why stories? Capture the human drama. Stories tend to put people facing a problem in a particular context. We see their actions, their relationships, their emotions, their mistakes, their successes, their tragedies. And stories, of course, unfold over time. Thus, they reveal the temporal structure and the time horizon of events. They illustrate the influence of slow-moving causes, of thresholds and tipping points. They can illustrate conjunctural causality. They can illustrate the role of path dependency and path creation. And note that those kinds of factors take us to a different kind of theoretical understanding than traditional positivist variance-based approaches take us. And the other advantage is that when a narrative, when a story is filmed, the audience is in the room with the action, up close and personal. And has, I think, long been recognized that stories, because they reveal event sequences in which outcomes are explained by a sequence of events and the combination of factors at different levels of analysis interacting over time, stories by definition are implicit process theories. So we can't ignore popular culture quite so readily. This is 3 examples of how Marcus and I have used extreme fiction and taken this to publication. One was an article based on George Romero's zombie movie Day of the Dead, which appeared in Management Learning a couple of years ago. Another was based on a TV series, The Walking Dead, which some of you may have seen. That appeared in Academy of Management Perspectives, again, last year. And also we published a very short piece in a management practitioner journal called Training Journal on how one could use zombie movies in particular in management development, in leadership development settings. So I offer that as some living proof that if one were to use this approach in our research, it's risky, let's admit that, but it is potentially publishable. I've just realized that I didn't define what I meant by extreme fiction. Simple definition is just radically imaginative narratives of crises and disasters. That's all I mean by extreme fiction. But just to take that a little bit further, as we know, the standard textbook tells us that when we choose material to study, a sample, an organization, or in this case, perhaps a movie or a novel, we should go for the representative. We should go for the typical. One of the problems with that approach is that if you choose the representative and typical, you might end up with representative and typical findings. But the opportunity for learning, or a better opportunity for learning, might arise if we choose outliers, extremes, mavericks, critical incidents. These kinds of settings may give us better opportunities to learn, better opportunities to spot the unusual. In other words, outliers matter too. And of course, movies, almost by definition, are often deliberately idiosyncratic. They're deliberately extreme. They're chosen because they illustrate outliers and the extraordinary. There are 2 problems, and Darren, you mentioned the first of these, which is just getting research access. It is possible, but it's relatively rare. Most of us struggle, and it's certainly even more difficult unless you're extraordinarily lucky to get real-time access to extreme contexts and events. But the other issue is, if we go back to my comment about normalized unprecedentedness, it's going to be useful if we can study events and come to some understanding of events that haven't happened yet. And one way to do that, of course, is by turning to extreme fiction of the kind that Barbara has already introduced us to, where somebody has imagined an extreme event, the collapse of our moon, and a potential extinction event here on Earth. And as we know, in extreme contexts, otherwise fairly routine organizational processes are highlighted. They come to the fore: leadership, management, decision-making, governance structures, communication, coordination, teamwork, you name it. So these are settings in which the kinds of topics that organization and management theory are interested in, they have the spotlight placed on them. Okay. Another question that Marcus and I have been asked is, well, if you're going to use extreme fiction, movies in particular, how do you choose? There's a lot of them out there. Well, I think there's a number of criteria. Being interesting, entertaining, they have to deal with some of the issues in which we're interested, theoretically and practically. They should be empirically and theoretically rich. But behind all this, I think there's one single key question, and that is, what is this a case of? And to go back to two of the papers I mentioned earlier that Marcus and I have published, The Day of the Dead can be read as a case of leadership configurations and changing leadership configurations. Some configurations are more successful than others, and some leadership configurations can be fatal for those who are involved. Looking at The Walking Dead, this can be read as a case of violent group behavior, intergroup and intra-group violence and extreme violence. And it makes an interesting case study looked at through those lenses. One movie I haven't mentioned, it's more recent, is Greenland, starring Gerald Butler, and it can be read or watched as a case study of crisis mismanagement. If you want to see ways in which you can completely cock up the management of what turns out to be a potential extinction event, this has all the answers, tells you how not to do it. The fourth one I mentioned here, you'll notice that Day of the Dead, The Walking Dead in Greenland have got ticks against them. When you turn to World War Z, a lot of people have asked me, Marcus, why haven't you used World War Z? Well, there's a book, which I think is very good, and there's a movie, which is also very good in a different way. But if you ask the question of World War Z, what is this a case of? It's simply a case of Brad Pitt saves the world again. So it's not very useful, or I haven't found it useful for our purposes in this regard. Marcus and I have identified 5 approaches to using fiction, and I'm not going to read my way through this in detail. I can send you a detailed account of this should you wish, but this is an attempt to do a couple of things. One is to persuade those of you who think that this is a crazy idea, that other researchers have done it in the past and been successful and published their work, dating back to 1975, when Will Wright studied Western movies and did a thematic analysis of the plots of Western movies, identifying how their plots mirrored changes in American social values and norms, through to provoking theory, case study, process narratives, proxy ethnography, provoking theory. So this is an attempt to demonstrate that others have taken this route and been successful and produced what I think is some interesting work. Okay. Perhaps the most interesting of these is provoking theory, where the aim is, films have been used typically in organization and management teaching to illustrate theories, to illustrate ideas, to illustrate concepts in the classroom. What these approaches are doing is developing fresh understanding, fresh insights. And one of these is developing provoking theory, which overturns conventional assumptions, forces us to look at conventional issues in entirely new ways. This is a kind of what happened. Something always goes wrong in these presentations, and this slide should actually be headed "Summary: The Case for Fiction." And for some reason, that has been lost, and I've absolutely no understanding of why. And you'll see that the case for fiction is a long one. So I've done that deliberately. Okay, there's not just one or two reasons. There's a large number of reasons why, as researchers, we should pay attention to these fictions, extreme fiction in particular. It's an alternative lens. It triggers the imagination. It's a source of inspiration and new ideas. What if? It reveals physical, social, and emotional complexity. It gives rich, contextually embedded and temporally sensitive portrayals of events. It gives us access to events that could happen in the future. It takes us into settings that are off limits for safety or security reasons. It puts us as researchers in the room with the action in real time and context. We get potential access to new evidence to develop and test new theory. It allows the rehearsal of behavioral and emotional responses to future possibilities. I don't think I'm trying to argue that all research from now on in extreme contexts or in organization and management studies in general should rely solely on extreme fiction. This is an approach that complements more conventional, more formulaic, perhaps safer research methods. So it's another tool. It's another tool in the toolbox, okay? And interestingly, recent research suggests that extreme fiction can provide a form of stress inoculation, reducing surprise and strengthening resilience in the face of actual events. In fact, it's not just recent research. This goes back to some of the work of Irving Janis in the 1970s. Irving Janis is a name that most of us are familiar with, linked to the concept of groupthink, but he did other research, and this was one of them. And a couple of authors called Czarniowska and de Montu once argued that novels, stories, narratives can actually be superior for some of these kinds of reasons to traditional business case studies. Barbara, my duty as a presenter is, I think, sometimes is to end not just with a provoking question, but with a cartoon. And what I think we often find is that fiction does actually come close to either to reality or to what reality might become. And I'll just leave you with this final reference by a guy called Jeffrey Lewis. It's published in 2018, and the title is The 2020 Commission Report on the North Korean Nuclear Attacks Against the United States. And it's a spoof, of course, but it's terrifyingly close to what could have been the reality in 2020, and from 2024 onwards could become the reality again.